You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Mule Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Mule Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Everybody knows I'm a Mule Fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Corsi.
Great to have you today on another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. Joining me today, not an unfamiliar guest to Wild Things and Wild Places, Rebekah Rafferty. Welcome.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me today.
No, thank you. Those that weren't able to attend the Cowboy Christmas Ball, they weren't privy to the opportunity to listen to you directly and the public announcement that came out that week in December of the second annual MFF Fellow. This is something that we started with your predecessor, Dr. Taylor Lashar, a couple years ago in partnership with the University of Wyoming, Hobbs School, Monteith Shop. But how does it feel now to be the second MFF Fellow?
Oh my gosh, it's first of all just such an honor. And I guess initially I was very surprised because when I first started, so the fall of 2021 was when Dr. Taylor Lashar had just become the first Mule Fanatic Foundation Fellow. And I was very new. Everything was very exciting. And I honestly didn't know how to do a whole lot of things yet. And to see Taylor in her role be honored as the first, just so amazing. And that was 3.5 years ago now.
Yeah, I can tell you we're equally excited and grateful for this opportunity. I am curious, Dr. Taylor Lashar, I think, held that torch as the first MFF Fellow very highly. Certainly all the congratulations to her and her professorship with Utah State University now and moving on in her career. But I'm curious how Dr. Monteith and the conversation that the two of you had for him to want to put you as the second MFF Fellow and your Ph.D. work in the Wyoming range. Can you give us a little insight to how that took place?
Yeah, it was a conversation we had late last semester, and I wasn't expecting it. I'm developing my proposal, and just for reference, my proposal is basically the introduction and methods of the 4 papers that I'm going to end up publishing for my dissertation, and that's like my dissertation requirement. So I'm developing these 4 ideas related to Wyoming range deer and population dynamics and really building from a lot of the things that we've learned from the work that Taylor and other students that have worked with Wyoming range data have published over the last several years. And so anyway, we were having some conversation about that, and I can't remember how it all took place, but all of a sudden Kevin looked at me and said, "Would you like to be the second Mule Fanatic Foundation Fellow?" And yeah, I think I was a little bit of a deer in the headlights. I was like, whoa, oh my gosh, of course I would love to, and big shoes to fill, and I'm going to do my best to do that moving forward, continuing to collect the data for the Wyoming Range Project, and then also building upon everything that has come before me, continue our understanding of what makes deer in the Wyoming Range what they are, how can we understand the nuts and bolts of the mechanisms driving all of those things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall when that conversation took place.
Yeah.
Kevin had given us an indication of where his head was at on this, and certainly just the experience and the opportunity to be able to work with you in the past. We were 100% on board. Specific to your work as a PhD student under the direction of Dr. Kevin Monteith, he's a big deal, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a big deal.
But specific to your work, this Wyoming Range Project has been now more than a decade, and it's certainly, I think, a great beacon for the importance of long-term research. But when you look at the historic Wyoming Range mule deer herd and how those deer have contended and continue to recover from harsh winters, certainly not far removed from the winter of 22-23 that had devastating impacts that you and I got to visit with on a previous podcast 18 months ago. I think that came out July 25th of 2023, which is unique to the podcast in itself, is that the podcast, we launched it early July of 2023. So really, I don't know that the podcast has had a lot of changes in what our role of being able to provide timely information is, but the work that was built now for more than a decade with the Wyoming Range Project, and certainly some of the environmental changes that we've seen, and to be able to look through the lens of individual deer. What do you know now that when we visited 18 months ago, you don't feel like maybe you knew then or had the insight to what you have now in this role?
Yeah, that's such a good question. 18 months ago, I think when we visited for that podcast, I was just wrapping up fawn captures for the spring of 2023, which was coming out of that extreme winter. And what was incredible, and I think we talked about this, what was incredible was that the animals had managed to put any viable offspring on the ground. So we did, as we would expect, have a lot of stillborns, because that winter, because it was so late, it was all of the things, right? It was like really cold, a lot of snow, and it persisted into like late April. And that's what I think set that winter apart from the other two bad winters that we've had during the period of data collection since we started the Wyoming Range Project in 2013. There's the 16-17 winter, which was a bear all across the winter range, and then there was the 18-19 winter, which was particularly bad in the south. Yeah, it was just crazy. And anyways, gestation, when deer are pregnant, the amount of energy that they have to put into developing their fetus follows an exponential curve. It really increases just exponentially every day. And when you have weather like that hit them when they're used to getting access to green forage, when they still have 3 feet of snow that they're dealing with, that we would expect to play out in birth traits. And that's what we saw that year. So we had really small fawns, we had a lot of stillborns, and then births were pushed way back into the summer. So it was, at that point, just, there was a ray of hope, because there were fawns that hit the ground that were viable, but they were still really small. And then fast forward to December of 2024, because we had a really wet summer and there were far fewer mouths out on the summer range to feed, the deer were incredibly fat that December, and then maintained that high level of fat through the winter, and were the fattest that we've ever seen them in March in the spring of 2024. And so what that set us up for, and we all knew, but I don't know, I found myself like, I don't want to get too excited about this, but what we were expecting was really big, healthy fawns in the summer of 2024. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. So our birth masses were the biggest that we've recorded on average since we started catching fawns in 2015. The sort of distribution of birth dates was really tight, because they weren't getting pushed by that late winter weather to have to extend their gestation to bring their pregnancies to term like they do during a bad winter. And then we had really high fawn survival throughout the summer, the highest that we've recorded. And then we just caught 37 juvenile fawns that had made it to December captures. The sort of other side of what I was experiencing when I spoke with you in the summer of 2023 is that we went through something that was unbelievable, and the deer went through something that was unbelievable, and we're getting to see how population like this recovers from a catastrophic event like that. Continuing to follow these females and these fawns as the fawns particularly grow up, and what they do in terms of where they set up their summer ranges, whether they set up their summer ranges where their moms live, where they gave birth to them, or whether they disperse to new summer ranges. And that's going to be really informative for kind of understanding how the population is going to recover and start to branch out and be able to potentially get back some of those summer ranges that were lost by losing the deer that lived there during the bad winter. Those are all of the things that I'm currently thinking about.
When you talk about predicting population dynamics in a wild and unpredictable ecosystem, that variable of what Mother Nature does is beyond control. Yeah, Rebekah, to be able to give folks an insight to some of the hands-on work of these individual captures and monitoring and the battery of tests that are done. You mentioned and you spoke of them being the largest that you have seen in the entire program or the research project's history that spans over a decade now. What does that look like? You're talking a body fat index, their reserves, their fuel that they're carrying going into winter. Was it that data set and that number that was just so significantly more than anything that had been seen prior to?
Yeah, so with fawns, when we initially capture fawns, it's just their total body mass. They don't have any fat when they're first born. So the metric that we rely on when we first capture a newborn fawn is just how heavy is it.
Give us an idea of a number or a measurement of what that looked like and how, as you indicated, with so much more moisture and so many less mouths on the landscape, what did that equate to in a physical development of a critter?
For reference, for adult females, in December of 2023, when we saw them, the fattest we've ever seen them, they were 3 percentage points higher than like the highest we've ever measured before. So they were almost 16% fat on average.
Wow.
And what that means is that 16% of the total body mass that we measure is what supports them when the food that they have access to during winter is less than what they need. So they can rely on those fat reserves to burn through that and support life functions when the environment is not providing them with everything they need to support their life functions. That is this metric of how prepared they are for winter. We know from Taylor's work that when an animal enters winter at 12% fat or more, she has a very high probability of surviving the winter, whereas if she's below 12% fat, her probability of survival declines as she falls below 12% fat entering the winter. And so when they came in to last winter at 16% fat, like that was really wild. For reference, the population level average coming into the bad winter into 2023 was around 12%. So they were ready coming into 2023, but 2023 was so extreme that we still lost 70% of our adult females. So that just puts it in perspective how extreme that was. And then moving forward to March fat, so we usually see them lose a lot of fat over the winter, and then in March of 2024, they were fatter than we've ever measured them in March. And so that translated to very large body masses, although one of the things that I'm going to be working on for my dissertation is understanding what influences body mass in our population. We know that have a higher probability if they're born big. So they have a higher probability of being able to get up and be mobile and hide more effectively from predators when they're very young, if they're born large. And so we're going to try to understand what affects in terms of females' body fat when they have access to resources during that last trimester of gestation, how well they are accessing resources before they give birth, those kinds of things, to try to understand what makes big fawns so that we can track how that body mass is linked back to everything that comes before it. The mean body mass of fawns from 2015 through 2023, on average in 2024, they were a pound heavier. And
that's significant. Yeah, absolutely it is.
Yeah.
What did fawn recruitment look like, not necessarily individually, but in sets of twins? Was that alarming to you? Was that higher than what you've seen in the past?
We had a lot of sets of twins recruited this year, and I haven't drilled down and looked at how it compares with the past since we got back from captures, but that'll be something that we'll work on this winter as well. But just anecdotally, I've been coordinating our helicopter captures since late, I guess my first December capture was December of 2021. That was when I shadowed Taylor, and she's taught me everything about how you run helicopter captures. This year, we had just as many, if not more, sets of twins than I've experienced before during December captures. So a lot of females not only gave birth to huge fawns that they recruited, both of them.
You'll recapture these critters in March or beginning in March, and then you'll be looking to try to get your hands on some more fawns during that partition, last week of May, first week of June. I guess that's probably what would be the normal time frame, but there's still much of winter to be had. What other variables are you being mindful of that you're trying to engage at a deeper level or do that deep dive to be able to just further add to this valuable research project?
This is the second winter after the bad winter. So we had 2023. 2024 was our first year after the bad winter. And what we saw in 2024, also, I should have mentioned this earlier, after the last bad before 2023, so the year after 16-17 and the year after 18-19, we also saw bigger fawns and pretty high survival of fawns. And so what we saw this year in 2024 with really big fawns and high survival, that just seems to be a trend. With we have a bad winter, there's a major reduction in density of adult females as a result of that bad winter. And then the following year, they're able to put a lot of resources into producing, and they have a lot of resources on the landscape, and they're really fat, and they have bigs, and they survive really well. And so what's interesting now is that we still have the reduction in density that happened as a result of 2023 was like so much bigger than after the other two bad winters. So the population estimate for that game and fish produced after the bad winter was around 11,000 animals, whereas before that it was over 30,000 animals. And that kind of reduction in density, we're in this new era of there's a lot fewer deer out there than there were before, and that's something that we haven't seen in the data set before now. And so now we're in the second year after the bad winter, and it's going to be really interesting to see, does the high levels of fat hold, does them being able to produce really big fawns hold 2 years after the bad winter, which we haven't really seen that before. It started to fall down as density has bounced back, recruitment and juvenile survival and animals surviving and recovering. But with this really low density, it's going to be really interesting to see, like, how long does it take for us to start seeing higher densities on summer range, lower fat levels of females, maybe start to see lower body masses of fawns over time. But we'll see as we move forward. But we're in this sort of uncharted territory of we've never had a situation like this where we just don't have as many animals out there, and to be able to see what that means for them with productivity and how long that kind of heightened productivity lasts.
None of us have that crystal ball, but I would like to think that one of the benefits of a long-term research project like this is that if there is something to be gained over the duration of a project like this and the time and the investment into a project like this, is it possible to be able to really dial in on what that carrying capacity of the landscape for this herd affords and allows for sustainability?
That is the billion-dollar question. And I think what's so interesting about that question is, as I've gotten to know these animals and the landscape that they live in and how, unpredictable it is. And it's unpredictable. We've talked a lot about winter, but it's also unpredictable in the summer during the growing season, which is when the landscape provides to them what's going to translate into that body fat that they carry down to winter range with them, that finances their winter survival and their ability to reproduce the following year. And we have drought years in the data set, we have really wet years in the data set, and we have everything in between. And then interspersed with that is like good winter, bad winter, mild winter as well. And so there's just an incredible amount of variation in the elements that produce nutritional carrying capacity. So that's one of the things that we are starting to think about, is like looking to summer range and trying to understand what are different aspects of summer range that may produce fatter deer or not as fat deer? Are there aspects of the habitat itself that lend to giving them more than maybe other aspects of the habitat? One thing we're focused on and starting to focus on is the role of fire, historic wildfires, as well as prescribed fire. There's a lot of pretty diverse disturbances across the summer range of the Wyoming range, and our deer, we can't control where they go, but we can learn from where they go, and we have a pretty broad representation in the data set of summer habitat and varying levels of disturbance and management on that habitat. And so one of the things we're going to be looking at moving forward is, okay, what about habitat may cause deer to do well, recruit more, get fatter, and the converse of that as well. And did that translate to higher resilience of animals going into that bad winter of 2023? And are there certain places on the landscape that might serve as what we think of as sources, where it takes a lot of adversity to cause those animals to die during winter because they have really good habitat and they get really fat. Whereas are there other places that are more what we think of as sinks, which are places that maybe the animals that live there don't get as fat. So we're starting to think about that, and then the role of winter in carrying capacity as well. Summer represents the potential carrying capacity, and that changes as a function of habitat potentially, and then as precipitation. One year is going to be maybe better than another year, and so each year entering the winter, we may have a carrying capacity, a potential carrying capacity of the population that's different than it was the previous year, because the previous year had less moisture, more moisture, whatever. And then depending on how severe the winter is, that can either lower carrying capacity, allow it to remain the same, or maybe the winter's really mild and we have a really high juvenile survival because of that, and we see some population growth because of that, and an increase in the carrying capacity. Those are all the sort of dynamic things that we're thinking about. And then mule deer are, because they're so faithful, when you have 30% of adult females die like we did during the 2023 winter, the knowledge of the places that those females lived in the summer, because they're so faithful and now they're gone, that knowledge potentially is also lost, depending on if they had daughters or mothers or sisters that also know where that place is and how to get there and how to use it. So there's this behavioral aspect to carrying capacity as well, where, you know, there may be so much viable habitat out there in the summer that's going to provide really high quality food and make deer get fat, but if they don't know it's there and if they're not using it, then there's a behavioral stop on carrying capacity, and they can potentially limit themselves. And so that's why it's so important for us to understand rates of dispersal, and if fawns are going to disperse during their juvenile year, and find those places and be able to use them and thrive there, to understand how the carrying capacity will, I guess, the sort of like realized carrying capacity of what the animals are using, if that matches like what is potential that the Wyoming range can actually provide them.
Yeah, fascinating, Rebekah. I did want to ask you, though, as someone who has been involved in this project prior to being named the MFF Fellow, what are some of those tools in the toolbox that are missing or that are in their early stages of development in regards to technology? I know we've come a long way in just the last decade. That's not to stop. We're always getting better. We're always looking for better ways to do what you do specifically. What are some of those that you're excited that someday we can hopefully bring to fruition?
It's so interesting kind of looking back, and I didn't have a very like intensive wildlife experience before starting this position. I had worked in wildlife a bit, but was mostly doing not hands-on monitoring, and so I don't have the historic sort of reference point for how quickly the technology has changed, and I feel like I'm a little bit spoiled in the fact that our GPS data are hours hourly and everything's pretty reliable. And I get an email when a deer gives birth. That's something that's only happened in the last decade or so. We used to have to fly to pick up the actual signal that the transmitter was emitting to see if it was like a fast pulse or a slow pulse to be able to determine whether she'd given birth or not. Things have just really advanced very quickly. One thing that I'm really excited about that we're just starting to play around with data-wise is on the collars that the deer wear. They send GPS locations to the satellites, but they also have what's called an accelerometer inside of them, and I don't understand a tenth of how it works, but it records what we call activity data from the animal, and it's got these, I think there's 3 axes in there, and they're motion sensors, and so they can actually detect movement at a very fine scale. Actually, 2 other Ph.D. students in my lab in the Monteith Shop, Rachel Smiley and Seth Rankins, they've been working on a project to actually train those data to be able to identify different behavioral states of the animal. And so Rachel actually went out to Washington and put some of our collars on captive deer at Lisa Shipley's facility out in Washington, and she ground truthed the behavioral data. So she sat there and recorded what they were doing, if they were feeding, if they were resting, or if they were moving around, and the timestamps of that. And then she linked that to the collar data to be able to train the data. And then we can use that with all of the other data from the collars on animals that we're not watching every single minute to classify those behavioral states. Then we can look at, how does foraging time affect birth mass of fawns, for example? Are there animals that are foraging more, or maybe foraging more in places with higher quality vegetation? How does that affect things like birth mass? So anyway, that's a new frontier that we're working towards being able to use some of those data to answer some more kind of fine-scale mechanistic questions, which is pretty exciting moving forward.
I would like to think that at some point in the future, particularly with the hands-on research efforts, that you're able to be intimately involved with these critters at a hands-on level, that we can also get to a point where we can be able to each of these critters. There's great concern, not just across Wyoming, but across the West, across the United States, for that matter, with CWD, that we would be able to always incorporate and include a part of every opportunity that we have to be able to look and have a test that we can do on a live animal instead of having to have a deceased or carcass to be able to have that type of testing. The power of information, right?
Absolutely, and technology's thankfully advancing at very fast rates, and also maintaining that presence in the field is the flip side of that coin, and it's challenging, right? We can collect so much data using these remotely sensed habitat data and everything from our collars, but being there on the ground and actually connecting with an animal to be able to test it for CWD or measure its body fat or measure its weight and then tie all of those things together, go hand in hand. And the technology is such a cool supporting mechanism for that.
Yeah, so I know you have captures coming up, although sometimes I'm sure you're just gosh, we just wrapped up captures. But you'll be gearing up for captures again here in about 6 weeks, 7-8 weeks maybe. But what's the summer look like? Yep. I know that following the winter of 22-23 with those mortality signals, there was a lot of effort that was put into looking at fecal material, looking at bone marrow. How are mortality signals thus far? I know it's still the early onset of winter, but are things looking good? I'm assuming that they are.
Yeah, things are looking pretty good. We actually lost a very old adult female, and she died of malnutrition, which is something that also predicts overwinter survival, and we know that from Taylor's work as well. So age and body fat are really important for older females, just have a lower probability of surviving the winter and have a higher probability of dying of malnutrition, and oftentimes they're less fat, so that things hand in hand. A few predation events on as well. Juveniles at this point is how we'd classify them because they're over 6 months old now. We've had a couple coyote predation events and a mountain lion predation event actually that I picked up last Sunday on the North Winter Range. But overall, it's still early. It's pretty mild out there. I expect and hope that we'll have high overwinter survival of juveniles and again hang on to some of the that we caught this past summer. And then probably pretty likely we'll have high overwinter survival of adult females because we have a lower proportion of older females in the sample now because so many old females died during the bad winter. So we have a lot of prime-age females in the sample that are they're pretty resilient to winter. So I expect it'll be pretty high, but we'll see how it plays out. Things could change here in the next couple of weeks. We're at the witching hour right now with winter and not really knowing how it's going to play out and a long time before spring still.
I'm just trying to look at what a calendar looks like for the job that you do. What's a calendar year look like for what you're doing?
Yeah, great question. The motto for the Monteith Shop is one data point at a time. Heaven say many times that our data are hard won. So every data point is hard won. And I guess I was just saying we have the technology, but we also have boots on the ground. This project is incredibly field intensive. I would say starting in January, you just said I'm really just monitoring mortalities. If a deer dies, I go out there and do my best to determine how and why it died. And I'm based out of Laramie in the winter, and so it's really awesome to have. We have all of our partners and collaborators that are the agency folks that live out where the Wyoming range deer live, and they are awesome and help out a lot in the wintertime with helping pick up mortalities as well and doing necropsies to determine cause of death. So that's a big support system in the winter. In March, we only capture our adult females, so we're not recapturing any of the fawns that we just caught, although there were some fawns that we didn't catch in December because they were still migrating and just really they were timbered up and we couldn't get to them with the helicopter. So we will catch those fawns in March so that we can put adult collars on them. But other than them, I think there's 8 of them that we weren't able to catch in December that are still alive. And then we'll catch all our adult females, assess pregnancy status, put their transmitters in, which will tell us when they give birth in May and June. And then I go back to just mortality monitoring for the month of April and early May. And then in May, we start our summer field season with vegetation monitoring on winter range. We've had permanent transects on winter range since 2013 when the project started. Utilization of sagebrush, and so we're going out there to these places, and we go to the same places every year across both winter ranges. We look at the percentage of each plant that has been browsed on by deer, so we can get an idea of where the deer have been utilizing sagebrush, how much of it is utilized over the winter. That gets paired with in the fall, so jumping ahead to October, we go back to all of the same places on winter range and measure production of sagebrush, how much new, what we call current annual growth, like how much of the liters of new growth of sagebrush grew over the summer. And that's pretty variable from year to year, but that's an index of like how much food they have going into the following winter. So those are our sagebrush protocols in the spring and in the fall. And then in the middle period, we have fawn captures, like you said, and then we transition to veg transects on summer range. And so we're actually going to the summer ranges of our adult females. And this is where some of the stuff I was talking about earlier with fire comes in. So we're actually monitoring vegetation in summer ranges where our deer live in wildfire areas. And then we're pairing that with deer that don't live in wildfire areas so that we can compare them. So we're measuring and recording veg information all summer and also collecting fecal data from summer range as well to be able to potentially look at diet composition of the deer that live in those places in the summertime. And then in the fall, we transition into sagebrush. We also track down all of the adult males that we have collared and take photos of their antlers so that we can track their antler growth over time without having to catch them and handle them to measure their antlers every year. We will catch them occasionally to switch out the battery on their collar and also switch out the elastic expandable band on their collar, which accommodates their neck swell in the fall during the rut. But that wears out over time, so we replace it every couple of years. But on the years that we're not catching those males, we track them down and take photos of their antlers. So that's a pretty big field commitment in the fall. And then head straight into December captures and
start over,
start
right?
it all over.
Yeah, quite the
It's
calendar of events for sure. Rebekah, I can't thank you enough for the work that you do. I know it takes a special human being to have this type of focus and interest to be able to be in this arena and to be the scientist that you are. I know that you're very grateful for the work that you do and the opportunity that is ahead of you. But really, my most sincerest gratitude and thankfulness for just what you're doing and the impacts that it has. I know sometimes it probably feels like a thankless job, but there are many that appreciate the effort that you put forth to do this and do it right. And the team and the folks that you work with, it's first class. It's 100% first class.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks for saying all of that. And your all's support of Fellow, of us, the Monteith Shop, in all of the various ways that you support us, from being able to have a conversation like this with you and share this with your listeners, to providing what you provide for the fellowship itself, and your commitment and support of research is incredibly grateful for that, and to be a part of it and to get to have these conversations with you. So thank you for your commitment to research and science and spreading the word and helping folks understand the stories that we're trying to piece together from these deer and how they make a living on their landscapes. It's pretty incredible to get to chat with you about all of it.
Speaking of being able to share this with others, looking forward to you being at Mule Deer Days and at the Mile High Hunt and Fish Expo in April in Denver, and for folks to have an opportunity to engage with you individually, one-on-one. I think that's going to be extremely important. I know this will spur some questions. One question that I know, and we didn't touch on it, and I know I said we're not going to be as long as we were in July of 23. A conversation like this is just so engaging and so informative, and there's just so much information out there that it's hard for me not to want to try to dabble in as much of it as I can because it is so fascinating. Total number of that you spend the year monitoring on individual deer through GPS. What is that number? Is it 70 plus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we maintain 70 plus adult females, and then our male sample is 30. So we have 30 collared males each year, and then we try to catch all the fawns that our adult females have. So if they're pregnant in March, we try to catch their fawns in May and June. That total number kind of depends on pregnancy rates, which are usually very high, and how many adult females die between March captures and when they would give birth. So if we have females that we lose in that time period, those are fewer fawns potentially caught. Our number of the fawns really vary. It was at an all-time low in the spring of 2023 because we only had 27 adult females survive. And so we had a lot fewer fawns that year. This last year, we either caught or accounted for 100, and so that's including that we collared and then also that we found that were stillborns. I think we had 8 stillborns this year, so we collared 90 plus this year, so that's on the high end, and then kind of everything in between. So it varies total from at any given time, depending on if it's before fawn captures or after, between 100 and 140-ish callers at any given time.
Wow. The people that support this, there's many partners involved. Certainly, if you start naming them, you're going to leave somebody out because there are so many. But I think what can't ever be lost in this is the thankfulness to individual sportsmen and sportswomen that support through their efforts and involvement and engagement with groups like ours that are similarly aligned to ours to support sound science and research. It takes everybody to be able to do this and do it right. And I'll forever be grateful that that type of support exists within our sportsmen and sportswomen community.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important and so great to have people who are interested in this work and see the value in it and understand the outcome that understanding things at this level, you just said it's such a huge effort, but the return on that effort, I think, is much like the return on investment. I'm not an economist, but the return on investment with like how rich we are in the data that we have and the types of questions that we can answer about the very fine scale mechanisms at play in this population that are leading to the bigger trends that we're seeing in abundance and survival at the higher level. And yeah, sportsmen and sportswomen that see the value in that, support it, it takes a village, right? And it's really wonderful to have that support.
Rebekah, it's been a pleasure to visit with you. It's certainly one of many more conversations I'd like to be able to have with you as this project continues and your involvement with this project. It's absolutely fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks again for the opportunity to share with you. I'm excited for all of those conversations. And then, yeah, like you said earlier, at the Mile High Hunt and Fish Expo and Mule Deer Days, yeah, I'm excited to just get to connect with folks and answer questions and have conversations and just keep the dialogue going.
All right, Rebekah Rafferty, MFF Fellow number 2. With the Monteith Shop, part of the Hobbs School of the University of Wyoming, visiting about her valuable work. Very grateful for the opportunity to have this time with Rebekah. And till next time, happy trails.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a muley fanatic.